Nothing But the Truth. Hello, I'm Raj Chengappa from India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. This is my weekly x-ray of key issues that matter to you. For nearly 2 decades, Indigo did something miraculous in Indian aviation. It made punctuality predictable. If you had a wedding to attend, a conference to reach, a job interview to make, you booked 6E, or a very neat advertising pun, which made it sound uber cool, and you booked Indigo without thinking twice. There was no glamour, no champagne branding, no Maharaja mascots as Air India had, just one simple promise: we'll get you there on time. Now, Indigo's reputation was built on flights that boarded fast, took off on time, landed on time, and on fares that felt reasonable. The result was that Indigo became a behemoth. Over 2,300 flights a day, carrying close to 500,000 passengers. That was Indigo. It reached 90 domestic cities, 45 international ones, and it had a fleet of more than 400 aircraft that flew almost like clockwork. Now, from its inception, almost 2 decades ago, Indigo ran on a minimalist philosophy. It had one aircraft family. If you noticed, a lot of Airbuses, largely A320s. It had dense seating. You literally sat cramped in it. No free meals. You had to pay for them. And there were lightning fast turnarounds. The way they used the aircraft was almost every 12 hours they had utilization targets. And its cost per seat kilometer, called CASK by many experts, was among the lowest in Asia. Everything was optimized. It was shaved, trimmed to make it the most cost-effective and cost-conscious airline. Now, Indigo ran with one of the leanest pilot-to-aircraft ratios in global aviation. It sort of dazzled aviation experts because it only had about 13 pilots per aircraft. Just to give you an idea what that means, compare that with Air India, its nearest competitor, which roughly had 34 pilots to every aircraft it owned. Now, that difference is not cosmetic, it's structural. Indigo didn't believe in slack. Slack for it was waste. And with an annual profit after tax of rupees 7,000 plus crore and a market capitalization touching $25 billion, Indigo was the toast of airlines, not just in India, but across the world. And briefly, it actually was the most valuable airline company in terms of market capitalization across the world. Such was Indigo's reputation. Now, the model worked beautifully as long as it was in what Indigo called business as usual. But something did change, and that change wasn't a surprise for Indigo. In January 2024, India's aviation regulator, the DGCA, or the Director General of Civil Aviation, notified what is called revised flight duty time limitations, or FDTL rules for pilots. Now, these are fatigue management norms, and they decide how long pilots can work, how much rest they need, how many night landings they can do, and these may be technical and invisible to a passenger. I'm just reading a few of them, but they are the scaffolding on which all flight safety is ensured. For years, India's fatigue rules lagged behind global standards. Pilot unions fought legal battles. Safety experts warned about burnout. Courts intervened. Eventually, the DGCA, or the Director General of Civil Aviation, rewrote the rules. 22 clauses were put in for based on what is called fatigue science and were meant to be implemented. Now, these included increasing the weekly rest for pilots from 36 hours to 48 hours. That was very important for them. Night duty rest was extended from 5 a.m. to 6. Earlier, it was from 12 to 5. Now, it would move from 12 to 6 a.m. in the morning. And weekly night landings were slashed from 6 landings to 2. Pilots could no longer be rostered endlessly through nights. And these rules were rolled out in 2 phases, July 1st and November 1st. Now, and here's the key point. Airlines were given nearly 2 years to prepare. which is precisely why what happened in the first week of December to Indigo flights felt so jarring and unforgivable. I'm giving you this background because you need to understand the entire ambience in which this collapse happened. Here was this airline, which was the #1 airline across the country. It controlled almost 60 to 64% of the share of flights, was seen as one of the wonders of aviation because many companies before that, if you recall, Kingfisher, Jet Airlines, Jet Airways, a whole host of them just packed up when they competed on the Indian skies. Here was Indigo actually making, as I said, a huge profit. Now, when Indigo's flight services collapsed, causing mayhem across Indian airports, it came as a huge, huge surprise and a setback. If you recall, between December 4th and 6th, just 2 days, nearly 3,000 domestic flights of Indigo were cancelled, and on one single day, which is December 5th, over 1,500 Indigo flights were cancelled, or 70% of Indigo's flights. That's not disruption. That's systemic failure. Airports, if you remember, the scenes across India look like abandoned warehouses, departure boards froze, luggage lay unguarded, lounges overflowed, people slept on floors, and airfares in other airlines exploded almost overnight. A Delhi to Bangalore or Bengaluru flight touched 80,000 rupees, considering that if you wanted to go to Europe, you probably spend the same amount of money. And so, how does an airline with the tightest cost discipline in Asia lose control so spectacularly as Indigo did? I'm just repeating this again so that you can edit this, Sana, and the audio team. I'm repeating this. So how does an airline with the tightest cost discipline in Asia lose control so spectacularly as Indigo did? Now, as I mentioned, the flight duty limitations that were imposed was not a bolt from the blue. Every airline knew what was coming, and every airline knew what it meant. If pilots fly fewer hours, you need more pilots to run the same schedule. Now, some airlines adjusted early. Air India, for instance, implemented the new norms for pilots ahead of its deadline. Others quietly built buffers, but apparently Indigo, the leader, didn't. On paper, Indigo told regulators it was ready. In meetings after meetings, October 12th, October 23rd, early November, and even December 1st, after the rules were implemented, Indigo assured the DGCA or its officials that it had adequate crew and could take care of what was going to happen. Its winter plan, mind you, was ambitious. Over 64,000 departures in November, which is a 10% increase over the previous year. So they had also increased the number of flights, saying that they could handle whatever was going to happen in terms of the flight duty norms that had been imposed upon them. But the numbers underneath told a vastly different story. Rather than increasing pilot strength, Indigo in fact reduced it. Lok Sabha statistics reveal from over 5,460 pilots in March that the Indigo fleet had, it dwindled to around 5,085 by December. These are the number of pilots, that's almost 400 pilots that left, and this was a 7% drop. Meanwhile, Indigo tightened leave quotas, its hiring of pilots slowed. The assumption, many experts say, it was seemed to be that delayed aircraft deliveries and regulatory flexibility would buy time for Indigo. In other words, Indigo clearly hedged. And that hedge depended on one belief, that when push came to shove, the system would bend for Indigo, that Indigo was too big to fail, and the aviators or the civil aviation officials would understand that and give them the leeway that was there. Now, this is where hubris enters the entire story of why Indigo collapsed. Remember, Indigo wasn't just another airline. It had a 60+% market share. It was the backbone of domestic civil aviation in the country. Was it too big to fail? As I had mentioned earlier, maybe not officially, but psychologically perhaps yes. And among certain circles, there was, say, a blunt hypothesis circulated. Indigo believed that the regulator would blink, and to be fair, regulators often had in the past. Exemptions were sought, relaxations were granted, we didn't know about it, and implementation was staggered, as we saw from January 2024. Almost 2 years were given to these airlines to implement the new flight duty rules of pilots. But reality has a way of catching up. And as you can see, the cracks began to show late November, just after the implementation of the new FDTL rules. Bad weather in the form of cyclone Ditwa disrupted operations in the south for Indigo and other airlines. Meanwhile, fog loomed in the north, largely pollution as well. Aircraft and crews slipped out of alignment. On November 29th, Indigo grounded its entire ATR network out of Chennai. By the end of November, the cracks were beginning to be visible. Instead of 403 aircraft that Indigo had, only 344 were flying. November saw over 1,200 cancellations for the entire month, 3/4 attributed to the new flight duty rules and rostering issues. But since it amounted to just 2% daily, there was no panic among the Indigo and the civil aviators that handle or control or regulate Indian aviation. There was another indicator. On-time performance fell from 84% in October to 67% for Indigo, but that too didn't raise the alarm. I'm mentioning these facts because you could see that everything is, from November 1st, the entire flight duty norms begin to be implemented. July 1st was the first tranche of 15. November 1st, the second tranche of rules were implemented, which meant all the 22 rules for the new flight duty rostering for pilots and in terms of their hours that they should be working had been implemented. And in November, there was some cause for alarm, but Indigos thought it was part, or they probably ignored it, or for whatever reason, we don't know, that an investigation was there. But it was clear that the famed Indigo system was still moving in November, but it was beginning to wobble. Now, when December arrived, at first, things looked actually deceptively calm, because on December 1st, nearly 2,300 flights operated. There were minimal cancellation. It felt like the storm that Indigo had experienced in November had passed. It hadn't. On December 2nd, cancellations started to jump, and this is where the story shifts from planning to systems. And here I need to explain a bit about how the rostering of pilots, or how pilots are allocated in terms of flights that they would be taking or flying, and what would be their layovers and everything else. That operation is put together by a sophisticated crew management software system developed by Jeppesen, the same system used by Lufthansa and Air France. And it optimizes, or let's say this kind of system optimizes rosters where it balances regulatory hard constraints like mandatory rest for pilots, night duty limits, with what is called soft preferences, like saying seniority and who should be flying that particular aircraft. So it reallocates crew in real time during disruptions. Remember, there are close to 2,300 flights. There's a phenomenal movement every day, and it's humanly impossible for one person or two persons to track. So the software actually does the job for them, and it was a proven software because worldwide, internationally, this software has been used. But software, no matter how advanced, cannot solve an impossible equation that had developed. As I'd mentioned, with pilot availability clipped by new fatigue rules and staffing buffers already razor thin in Indigo, the system was being asked to pair few legally rested pilots with more aircraft than the math allowed. So think about that. Here you have the system which actually calculates how many pilots are there, and how many aircraft are to fly, what are the flight timings, and then tries to resolve that. But if you have not increased the number of pilots, and yet you've put 10% more flights on it, the system begins to wobble. In fact, it jammed. This wasn't a glitch, it was a structural failure masquerading as a minor technical problem, as some of the senior people put it, but clearly there was laxity in terms of monitoring this, because there's no way the system could have collapsed unless the information that was being fed in, especially the new information that was there, saw it was inadequate in terms of allocation of pilots and then began to crash. By December 3rd, Indigo cancelled 257 flights. On December 4th, cancellations exploded. Over 600 domestic flights were cancelled, and by December 5th, that was the real nub. The emergency brake was pulled because as many as 1,588 domestic flights were cancelled, with barely 700 operating, and that meant almost 70% of Indigo's flights were cancelled. Now, the CEO, Peter Elbers, appeared in video apology speaking of a reboot, but to pilots, that explanation of a systems breakdown rang hollow. They were blunt. The software didn't fail. The staffing did. The system was never updated to reflect the new rules because the airline never truly adapted to them. That's what pilot or experts say about this. And in November, things ran smoothly, but pilots argued not because Indigo complied, but because it didn't. The failure only surfaced when the system was stretched beyond denial. Meanwhile, the consequences began to ripple outward, as we saw. Unfortunately, predatory airfares began to happen. The fares surged as stranded passengers scrambled for alternatives. Delhi-Bangalore flight, as I mentioned earlier, jumped 1,600%. The government stepped into cap fares. Nearly 1 million bookings were cancelled, and Indigo had to refund all that money. Close to 827 crores were returned to passengers in under 3 weeks. The DGCA, the country's regulator, issued show cause notices which rejected Indigo's inability to pinpoint causes and cut its winter operations by 10%. So the DGCA came down very, very strongly on it. Regulators stationed officers inside Indigo headquarters to monitor daily operations, which is an extraordinary step. And in Parliament, the Civil Aviation Minister, Mr. Ramon Naidu, called out what it really was. And he said, in one word, mismanagement by Indigo. So if you look at the entire episode, and this unfortunate episode, the worst ever aviation in terms of collapse of systems that has happened and cancellations and in aviation history, Indigo deserves the lion's share of the blame. Its obsession with cost leadership left no room for shock absorption. The very efficiencies that powered its rise, ultra-lean staffing, maximal utilization, tight scheduling, became liabilities when the rules changed. But the regulator, DGCA, cannot walk away either. The DGCA claimed it had held meetings. Yes, it did, but it relied heavily on airline declarations, and it allowed Indigo to expand winter schedules without independently stress testing crew adequacy. Vigilance was procedural, not forensic, and that's what experts say, that the DGCA should have questioned the moment Indigo started giving its statistics and the fact that they were monitoring the pilots available out there. Someone out there should have said, hey, your pilot strength is not matching with the increase in flights that you proposed, and what are you doing about that? Someone should have questioned rather than taking Indigo at face value. As many people felt, Indigo was just roughshoding the entire process and then paid the price. Now, this crisis also exposed a deeper structural problem and the fact that India has a duopoly. What does that mean? The two airlines dominate the skies in our country of 1.4 billion, that is Indigo and Air India. When one falters, the entire system convulses, especially if you look at the fact that Indigo controls 64% of the flights, Air India barely 27%, but together They control the entire skies, and if one of the biggest one fails, things go awry, surge pricing becomes inevitable, passengers have nowhere to go, and therefore this becomes a situation where things get exploited. And let's also not forget that while there are rules for compensation of passengers either because of cancellations or delays in flights, these are not very well imposed in India. And as compared to Europe and other countries where airlines have to pay a heavy price, this is something we need to look at as well and change the structure so that airlines will pay a heavy price if they cancel without proper excuses as to why they had to do it, or emergencies or exigencies that happen. Now, the minister, aviation minister, says India has room for 5 more airlines. He's right, but only if we confront the reasons airlines keep dying over here in India. We saw a lot of them die in the last 5 years, and that's largely because, one, experts say that there is over-regulation. The aviation ministry literally strangulates them with all kinds of rules and regulations that make it impossible this is their charge, for airline companies to run efficiently. And the second thing is over-taxation. Indian aviation turbine fuel, the government puts up a 40 to 45% tax of it, and this becomes part of the operating cost that they have to pay. And this is not to mention GST with excise and VAT and whatever the state governments impose. So margins are crushed before airline planes can even take off. And that's one of the reasons why you see so many airlines go bankrupt in India and find it very difficult to operate. Of course, Indigo is an exception. And let's not forget, Indigo didn't create the duopoly by blocking competition. It outlasted rivals who collapsed under structural pressure, whether it was, as I mentioned earlier, Kingfisher, Jet, Go First. These were the airlines that you can recently remember that went down. But with dominance brings responsibility. And unfortunately, perhaps also complacency, as we saw. Indigo's board is stacked with heavyweights, former regulators, administrators, industry veterans. Clout is undeniable, but it also could cause complacency and a sense that they cannot be taken on at all. Of course, the irony is brutal. Indigo's empire was built on efficiency. It was undone by overconfidence in that efficiency. The airline is now trying to recover, offering vouchers, promising external audits, engaging consultants. Temporary relief on fatigue norms has been granted till February for Indigo by the DGCA, but the lesson is already written. You can shave costs, you can optimize schedules, you can fly close to the wind, but when safety rules change, when weather turns, when human fatigue enters the equation, the margin for error is unforgiving. India cannot afford the collapse of its only runaway aviation success, but Indigo cannot afford to believe that success exempts it from structural reality and responsibilities. Punctuality was its product, trust was its brand. Those take years to build, and as we've seen, days to lose. The real test now isn't whether Indigo can reboot systems or hire pilots fast enough. It's whether it has learned that efficiency without humility is just another form of risk. And that's the truth. Nothing but the truth as to why Indigo collapsed and what is to be done and who really was to blame. For more details, you can read the latest issue of India Today, which carries an in-depth report on Indigo's failures. And thank you for being with me on this episode of Nothing But the Truth. I look forward to having you with me next week. Nothing but the truth.